So our topic today is the rise of populism. And so let me introduce all three individuals so I don't have to jump up and down as they decide to come up and share their information with you. First off is Colonel Daryl Driver. He's the Director of European Studies in the Department of National Security and Strategy at the Army War College. His prior positions include NATO Policy Director for U.S. European Command, Defense Policy Advisor with the United States Mission to NATO in Brussels, a visiting scholar with the Center for Transatlantic Relations at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Director of Strategy, George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies in Germany. Colonel Driver is the author of the book Sparta in Babylon, Case Studies in the Public Philosophies of Soldiers and Civilians, and a number of articles and book chapters on U.S. civil-military relations and international topics. He holds a BA from the University of Notre Dame and an MA and PhD in political science from Syracuse University. So this is Colonel Driver. Our next presenter is Colonel Felipe Quiro. He is the Director of Coalition Warfare, Department of National Security and Strategies. He received his commission as an infantry officer from Spain's General Military Academy in 1987. Prior to his arrival at Carlisle Barracks, he was assigned to the Defense Policy Directorate at the Spanish Ministry of Defense. His office was responsible to develop policies on NATO, European Union, and bilateral affairs. His previous assignments include service as the Chief of Staff of Spain's Heavy Forces Division, the Strategic Military Plans Division supporting the Chief of Defense, the J6 plans at the NATO Land Component Command in Madrid, and NATO Allied Command Transformation in Norfolk, Virginia. He also worked at the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, Strategic Military Cell, J5 branch at the UN headquarters in New York City. He graduated from the Joint Staff course in Spain and is a graduate of the Spanish Open University with a degree in law. Colonel Felipe Quiro. Last but not least of our presenters is Professor Mary Foster. She's a part-time adjunct professor for the United States Army War College's Department of National Security and Strategy and its distance education program, for which she facilitates seminars exploring European regional security issues. She also volunteers as a senior editor for War Room, the online journal of the United States Army War College. Prior to arriving in Carlisle, Ms. Foster spent 29 years abroad, of which 27 were in Europe, variously as a U.S. Army military dependent, a U.S. Army Reserve military intelligence officer, a U.S. Department of Defense civil servant, and a U.S. Department of State contractor and speechwriter for the United States Ambassador to NATO. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from the University of New Hampshire and a Master of Science degree in International Relations from Troy University. Professor Foster.
Thanks, Michael. Am I on? Can you guys hear me? All right, I don't know how long I'm going to stay behind here, but thank you for bearing with me for the little bit of change of format today. I don't normally research the topic of populism in Europe, especially. I typically focus on European Union and NATO defense relationships, particularly issues related to European strategic autonomy and efforts to build a European army. But we did add it this year for the first time, certainly since I've been here, and I think we've not really addressed it before. We've added it to the core course in European Studies that we teach every January at the War College for obvious reasons, because it's in the news. It's probably, one scholar said, one of the most important political transition that's occurred in Europe in the 21st century so far. So it's something we felt important to talk about with our students. And because that we were all sort of dealing with this in our seminars as we go through the course, I asked some of my colleagues, Felipe and Mary, if they wouldn't mind joining me And after I get done sort of providing you a bit of an overview, essentially correct whatever mistakes I make any additions that are necessary, or clarify any unclarified information. So what I'd like to do today is I'll talk a little bit about some of the pictures that are up here first. But I'd like to first talk a little bit about, when I say populism at least, what I'm talking about, because it's certainly a contestable term, right? And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that various scholars have associated with the term populism as a kind of groundwork for moving through first a bit of the trends in populism in Europe, so you can see that it isn't just a lot of smoke. There actually is heat behind it. There's certainly an expanding electoral base that is populist in nature, and I'll show you a little bit about that and some quick graphics. And then I want to at least suggest some of the causes for populism that some of the observers have offered that are out there. And you can decide for yourself which of the causes you think are most important, but I'll run through a number of them before closing with maybe some of the implications. Some of the implications potentially on foreign policy for these kinds of politics, and some of the implications for where does this end? How do populist movements sort of get to a place where we can say we're no longer in a kind of populist mood of politics? All right, so that's kind of what I want to do in the next 25 or so minutes, if that's okay with you. But first, just to introduce a few of the names that I'll be talking about here. You'll recognize many of these, I think, from some of the nightly newscasts, at least. The most probably recognizable, at least in the upper left-hand corner here, is Nigel Farage of UKIP, right? And you can see here the British people essentially without their voices, being muted, that is, by the European Union, making a case to the common people, if you will, of Britain, that in fact what ought to happen is Britain ought to go its independent way. We've got down here, and Felipe can comment more on this later perhaps, this is Vox. This is probably the newest of the movements. It's essentially, at least, that's raised its visibility on the international stage, having won some regional elections in the south of Spain a few months ago, and certainly a visible player in the elections potentially that will be forthcoming in another few months. We have Spain down here. Pepe Grillo, right, the founder or the starter, if you will, of the Five Star Movement in Italy. Viktor Orban's Fidesz party in Hungary, also associated with a lot of sort of populist sentiment. We have the Law and Justice Party, PiS, or PIS in Poland, due to the president now. Certainly has been in control of Poland now for several years. We have the Gilets Jaunes movement, which you've seen a lot more in recent weeks. And you can see right there, long live the anger on the back of that particular yellow vest. An effort that right now is in many respects being fought over by both the left and the right in terms of what kind of populism exactly is this. And then up here in the corner we have Alternative for Deutschland, which again is one that's been more visible in recent weeks. And you'll see there, what is your reason to fight for Germany, as the child is held clear reference to some of the cultural anxiety issues associated perhaps with immigration. And this is probably the hardest one to identify if you can't see that word right there especially, but that's the Swedish Democratic Party. And because I can't read all the way down either, I'll just tell you what it says. There on the entrance to that metro station in Stockholm, we see, sorry about the mess here in Sweden. We have a serious problem with forced begging. International gangs profit from people's desperation. Our government won't do what's needed, but we will, and we are growing at record speed. We are the opposition, and we promise real change. So you see there, you get a bit of a sense of the kinds of rhetorics that are typically associated with and employed by these movements. Now for what exactly I'm talking about by these movements. First of all, it's not an ideology. We can't talk about that in terms of American speak so much in terms of this is conservative or this is liberal. They come in all forms. People who study this typically talk about the defining characteristic really is a kind of narrative, a strategy, if you will, not an ideology, a mood, a style that essentially says, we the people, we common folk, if you will, we know better than the elites who have not run things properly, and we have all of these examples of why things aren't going well in our country, And if we, the pure people, were just in charge, we, the pure people, would then be able to essentially rectify the situation. So whatever populism is, somewhere at the core of that loose definition is this narrative, if you will, that goes out. Also at the core is this idea that if you're saying the people actually sort of know best, then what is that best? There is some sort of idea that there's a common sense way we should be doing this. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a political philosopher from the 17th century, essentially called this the common will, that there's something out there that we can all agree on. If we just had somebody who could sort of unite us and bring us together, we don't need all of these elites, these technocrats, these so-called experts in government that are in our capital, that we could essentially implement this general will, and that would be a true manifestation of democracy. That's somewhere in that narrative as well. Political pluralism, as a result of that general will focus, isn't typically, at least, something that's cherished by these movements. And it really does tend to, at a certain point, you get those narratives out there, there is a kind of host ideology. It may be a leftist ideology. It may be something in terms of especially what we're seeing more prominently in recent years, a rightist ideology, a nativist ideology, a nationalist ideology. So there's usually a host ideology associated with this movement, these kinds of movements, and I will talk a little bit about some of those in a minute. And then finally, we typically have a strong leader associated, right? So if there's going to be a general will, how do we agree on that general will? Typically somebody emerges, Pepe Grillo, Viktor Orban, Nigel Farage, who becomes a mouthpiece for these grievances, a mouthpiece for discerning the general will. It's not always the case. Marine Le Pen in France is an example, but it's usually the case that it's male and there's a kind of hyper-masculinity associated with these. Now again, you may not agree with all of these. They don't apply in every case that we'll talk about, but these are some of the general characteristics that we typically see manifest, or at least scholars who have looked at this see manifest in these kinds of movements. The final thing I would say is there are a couple of sort of pieces out there that may be of interest to you if you're looking to learn a little bit more. Stanley Sloan's Transatlantic Traumas, Cass Mood's Populism, A Very Short History, and Jan Werner Müller's What is Populism? Three pieces that have come out here in the last year or so. In fact, it's actually a growing body of scholarship because of the current interest. If you want to learn a little more. And these books and a few others are really kind of the basis of what I'm going to talk about for the remainder of today. So if that is kind of what we're talking about, then why are we talking about it? We're talking about it because if you go back to 1998, these are percentages, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25% of the vote aggregated across Europe of these kinds of movements' success in the polls. And what you'll see in blue here are the far-right populist movements. You see others, because there are, like En Marche in France, for instance, Macron's party in France. Some have called it a populist movement. Even though it's a very centrist movement, it does have at its core this kind of narrative that the elite parties, as they exist, have failed you, and that what we ought to be doing is, sort of this brand of politics that Macron is offering. But there are also far-left populist parties that are out there that I'll show you a bit of in a second. So I'm going to run through about 20 years now, just in rapid succession, so you can see a picture on the map of kind of what these trends look like. So if we go back to 1998, right, really light blue to white is around 0% of the popular vote in these countries. See, Poland is basically white here. As it gets darker over to the right of the ledger, you see the darker colors start to pop up on the map. So 1998, this is essentially how the British Guardian colored in the map in terms of what we would see in terms of populist movement. 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, 4, 5, 6, 7. We still have not hit the 2008 financial crisis, right? But we're starting to see some movement, nevertheless, in these parties. 2008, 2009, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and that's where we are today. So that's the general trend, at least, that The Guardian has certainly laid out recently, and it's why we're talking about populism in European studies, and it's why people are now starting to write books about the phenomena, and probably why you asked us to talk about it here today. So what has been the result of this? If you look across Europe, you can see where, in the darker blue again, populists have actually moved into control of government. And in the lighter blue, you can see where they at least have some share in a coalition of government and have actually been able to sort of move into power in these countries. If we look at instead of the popular vote, which is what you're looking at here, and we look at the number of Europeans now that are living, I should say what we're looking at here is the actual government control and government participation. But what you see here is the number of Europeans who now are living under governments with populists who are in some way participating in government. And you can see from 1998, you go from about 12 million to well over 170 million in 2018. So again, more on the trends of what we're seeing with respect to this kind of narrative being employed in the political process. All right, so now that we've talked a little bit about the trends, the upward trends. Now, what is underneath those? What kinds of host ideologies are present when people are talking about us, the people, and those dadgum corrupt elite? The fact of the matter is, as I suggested earlier, it spans the spectrum. As you might suspect, way over here to your right is the sort of more right-leaning politics. Way over here to your left, we have more left-leaning political ideological hosts. And from 2018 here on the bottom all the way up to 1998, you see the manifestation of these groups in terms of the density of the vote in their country as well as the overall number of votes. So obviously, bigger and darker is more votes. So we have Podemos in Spain on the left, we have Die Linke in Germany, and we have La France Insoumise, which is essentially the Communist Party of Mélenchon in France, sort of comprising really some of the more left-wing aspects of this approach to politics. Probably the most popular of those, the ones that you would have recognized the most, Five Star here in Italy. You see them really capitalizing in the most recent elections in Italy. As we move from left to right, you have Viktor Orban's Fidesz party in Hungary. We have Berlusconi's party continuing to make a comeback repeatedly, time after time. When they thought Berlusconi was gone, he keeps coming back into power in one way or another. Here we all grouped together, we have UKIP, UK, Great Britain. We have Law and Justice, Poland. And you have the Northern League, which is an interesting example of a right-leaning populist approach to politics. But they are currently in government with Five Star Movement, a left-leaning populist approach to politics. And it's causing a bit of friction, as you maybe have started to observe in how Italy negotiates its domestic politics. Moving over to the right, we see the Alternative for Deutschland, really starting to capitalize here in the last couple of years as the Christian Democratic Union, in particular, has begun to lose or hemorrhage some votes. And then finally, over here, we see Marine Le Pen's Front National in France as being another party that has employed this approach to politics. So I thought that was an interesting look at the ideological spectrum of what we're talking about when we're talking about us, the people, you, the elite. Major changes need to occur. All right, I'll talk you a little bit through now a series of these charts, more graphs, so bear with me. These are the countries that it's a survey on whether or not you are happy with the parties that essentially are available and run your government. And we have all the way over here, the blue is yes, I'm totally satisfied. And the red we have totally dissatisfied, and the gray up here is I don't know, right? Or refusal to answer the question or I don't know. So you can see here Denmark, Sweden, Ireland, Netherlands, Poland, is there, all up at 60% or higher on the left of the screen. What we see on the opposite end is the countries that have the least confidence in their governing parties, Spain, or I should say Greece, Lithuania, France, Bulgaria. Right? So it's interesting that as you begin to cultivate this narrative of the people know best, ruling elites don't, you can see that there's some pressure put on people's overall perception of those dominant parties. Here's another way of looking at it. Are you pessimistic about the future? Do you think you and your children will be worse off or better off? Let's look at Europe. About 64% in this particular Pew survey from 2015, published in 2016, in Europe said, we think worse off. And you can see how that compares with the rest of the world. U.S. isn't far behind. 28% said we think better off. So these kinds of attitudes really create a milieu, if you will, that's really ripe for the narrative that populists are offering. So the next thing is a little bit about the causes. And as you might imagine, there's not a lot of agreement. There is agreement broadly that it's a result of anxiety. What is causing it depends on who you ask. Is it really based on economic anxiety? Is it really based on more of a cultural anxiety? And most people agree that there are long-term, intermediate-term, and short-term trends that are all feeding this anxiety. So just, again, more graphs to kind of give you a sense of those various explanations. So this is a tool political scientists and economists use to measure inequality in society. So let me sort of talk you through it for a moment. If you had a 0 on the Gini coefficient scale, that would mean income in a society is completely even. Everybody has the exact same amount of money, right? If you have a 1 on the Gini coefficient scale, that means all the money, all the resources in society is owned by one person. So obviously, none of those fictitious worlds exist, so everybody falls in the middle. So if you care about equality, then what you want is a lower Gini coefficient, somewhere down here in the 20% or so range. The next thing I'll tell you is 2014 is the blue bar, right? 2014 is the blue bar. Let's just stick with that for now. Let's look at Denmark. 2014, the blue bar goes up. It's actually a pretty sort of equitable society, if you will, relatively speaking to the other nations in Europe. But look at these orange, I think that's orange, diamonds here. That represents where the Gini coefficient in that country was in mid-1980s. So you can see in Denmark, even in Denmark, it's gone up, right? Relative inequality's gone up. Look at a few other more dramatic ones here. Finland, relative inequality has gone up from a really low number in the 1980s to something that's on the lower end of the European Union today. Down here, United Kingdom, it's gone up, although not as dramatically as some of the other places. Greece, it's actually gone down, inequality's gone down, and that's probably a major function of the economic crisis they suffered beginning in 2008. France, it's gone down a little bit. But for pretty much most of the rest of those European states, inequality has gone up. Some have offered that as a reason we're seeing this kind of resistance, this popular resistance, this pressure on elites. Here's another way to look at it. This is different jobs based on whether that job is a high-earning job, a medium-earning job that requires non-routine labor. That means you have to do something different every day, think on your feet. Everything's about innovation to some degree, or a routine job, something where you could essentially stamp a car part, as I used to work in a Michigan car parts factory, do the same thing every day and get a middle class, decent income. Those kinds of jobs, this medium routine job, those kinds of jobs that used to fuel a robust middle class have been shrinking in Europe, certainly all across the United States, Japan as well, but certainly in Europe especially, right? Those have been going down dramatically. The non-routine medium jobs, you see some slight uptick, but those high-earning jobs are really the ones that have expanded their footprint in the employment sector. You can see that there's not much to say about the lower end, I guess, jobs here. They haven't really changed at all. between 2002 and 2014. Japan, they went up a little bit. In the US, they even shrank a little bit between 2002 and 2014. But these jobs going up and these jobs that feed the middle class going down. Some people say that's another indicator of this kind of narrative, if you will, in politics. Wealth distribution. So top 10% is in orange, and the intermediate middle, if you will, between 40% to 90% of wealth in a country is in this gray here, and everybody below 40% is in the blue. So if you could divide society up into those three groups, how much of all the wealth do the top 10% have in Austria? They have about 40% or so of the wealth in Austria, and the middle class essentially have the rest, and none to speak of in the lower 40% of the population. You can see what this looks like across the board here from the Slovak Republic. Let's pick another one, United Kingdom. Again, top 10% of the earners, wealth holders in a country have about 50% or so of the income. And you can compare that even to the United States and the entire OECD there on the far right of your screen. So another way to look at wealth inequality and whether or not that's actually a driver in terms of that economic anxiety that's fueling these kinds of political movements. And just a graphic that really just looks at whether or not, or to the degree to which the unemployment rate might be affecting some of this. You can see where there is strong employment. If you're under 3% or so, or under 4% unemployment, you're in blue. If you're lighter blue, you're under 6% unemployment. And as you go toward the yellow and the orange and the red, unemployment is getting higher and higher until you see the red shaded areas with unemployment at least over 15 or so percent. This is from 2017. You can look at the fact that there's actually a geographic dimension to some of these economic challenges as well. And that geographic dimension largely splits along north, south, geographic divides in Europe. One more thing on unemployment. This is youth unemployment. 2007, the blue bars. 2015, you see the white-shaped diamonds now. You can see where it's not only the case that unemployment has moved up, inequality has moved up. The youth have been particularly challenged by this, and they're talking now about the 15 to 29 year range. 2015, you have these white diamonds really, in most countries, stretching well up above where typical employment is in that particular country. So the youth have been the hardest hit by some of these economic transitions. I won't say economic recessions, because we certainly went through one, but overall this period, what we've seen is even when the recovery has happened, it's been a transition in that not everyone, if you believe these figures, has benefited necessarily equally. So how does this translate then? If you just looked at a map and you said, okay, where is the economic success happening and where is the economic success not happening? You can see the lighter colors are areas in Poland where GDP is lower. You see the darker colors are areas in Poland where GDP is higher. And we see Warsaw here in the middle. Again, a lot of those big cosmopolitan areas seem to be weathering these crises, at least overall. Now there's inequality within them, but at least overall better than some of the rural areas. And if you just looked over at the difference here in the 2015 Polish presidential election, you can see some correspondence here, really. A lot more rural, not as industrialized sector of the country where law and justice peace was successful. You have the East, a lot more integrated into the German economy in particular, a lot more industrialization, where Civic Platform, which is a more centrist party, had more success. And we can look at a number of maps where we can see those kinds of things. But it's not always clear. Some areas you'll see good economic growth, but you'll still see the resurgence of some sort of populist brand of politics. So even that's confusing. So let's leave the economic realm for a minute, because not everybody points to economics as the reason for some of this malaise. Other people talk about cultural issues, and in particular, they like to zero in on immigration. And if you've been watching the news in Europe, you know it's been at the top of most news cycles for at least 4 or 5 years. So how to read this? Again, European Commission asked in a variety of nations across the EU, what percent of the existing population in your country do you think is migrant? That's what you see in the light blue bar, what people said. Then they checked it against actual statistics that they had to see exactly what percent of individuals in the country were migrant, and that's what you see in the lower blue bar. So let me pick a couple here. The EU 28, this is all the EU nations, on average have about 7.2% of individuals living in the European Union right now are migrants, and the EU 28 on average believe that that number is closer to 16 or closer to 17, in fact, percent. Where's the UK? UK in here? Right there. When asked, UK citizens said we're at about 21% migrant population. It's actually closer to 8.6% migrant population. So the numbers are there. That's true. There has been an inflow. But the belief about the numbers is even more dramatic, particularly in areas where they themselves don't see a lot of the migrants moving through. So those are the places where you tend to see more concern that these numbers perhaps are higher than they are. Here, I'll just quickly show you this. This is 2015. I was living in Garmisch, Germany at the time, and we were housing in a lot of the old hotels. If any of you have ever been to Garmisch-Partenkirchen, there are a number of hotels there. All of them save one, the Edelweiss, which was more recently built, were turned over to the German government, and they, in 2015, became a halfway house for a lot of the migrants that were flowing into Europe, because as you know, Angela Merkel had essentially opened the doors. I think that's a harsh term. She was more accepting of immigrants than some of her other colleagues in the European Union, and that created a bit of a schism in the politics of the Union at the time. But you see the manifestation of that right here. We have the number of migrants that flowed into Germany, clearly outpacing almost every other country in the European Union at the time. Some other countries that were particularly hard hit, if you will, at the time, you see Hungary, you see France, you see Sweden, these being countries that were a preferred destination for a lot of the migrants, but you see Italy, especially since Italy is right there on that Mediterranean corridor. And the migration essentially began to shift back and forth after that, and right now where we are is a situation where Turkey is housing a lot of the longer-term migrants in exchange for payments from the European Union. So we're at a bit of an impasse, at least in terms of the immediate crisis. So who has border worries? All right, if you think the Schengen Zone, and by the way, the Schengen Zone, not all the European Union, you can't get into the European Union and go everywhere you want. Only those countries in the European Union that have agreed to be a part of the Schengen Zone have taken down all the borders, right? You can't go from France to the UK today any more than without a passport and your papers, if you will, and a border check than you could before as an individual citizen. But that question for the Schengen Zone, they really went out and they asked everyone in the European Union 28, what do you think about the Schengen Zone? Has it been a good deal or has it been a bad deal in terms of the security for your country? You see Lithuania, way over here on the left, says 75% or so says it's been a great deal. We love the Schengen Zone. But you can go all the way over here to the United Kingdom, which was actually never in the Schengen Zone, and it's not such a great deal for the United Kingdom. They don't like it so much. Now, there are rules outside of the Schengen Zone that are associated with employment, so you can easily move inside the European Union and get employment. So some of this frustration could be less with the inflows of people across border from North Africa and the Middle East, and some of the frustration instead could be more from individuals from the east of Europe who are in the European Union coming to the United Kingdom to work, particularly in the service industry. And so you ask them the question, is growing diversity in your country making your country a safer place to be, or is it a better place to be, I should say, or a worse place to live? If you're in the dark orange here, those are the people in those countries that are saying it's a worse place. If you're on the green, you're saying it's a better place. Greece, 63% say all this new diversity is making it a worse place to live. You go down to Spain, where you have, in 2016, that is, 22% of the population saying it's making Spain a worse place to live, 31% saying a better place, and 45% shrugging their shoulders in the middle. Now, this is an interesting one. I'm getting close to the end of these graphs. I'm sorry to kill you by graphs, but it's not clear-cut always, and I think these numbers are interesting to look at. So the upper right quadrant here, those are the countries you see there are the countries whose population rises with or without immigration. They don't need immigration for their population to continue to rise. Ireland, France, Britain, barely, Norway. All right? The countries in the lower right quadrant down here, population rises with immigration but falls without it. They need immigration if population is going to rise. We can see a variety of them. Luxembourg, we see Germany kind of on the cusp here of the next one I'll talk about. Denmark, Belgium. In fact, most of the countries in the European Union are in that category. Why is that? Because of demographic decline in those countries. Ordinarily, if you don't have an influx of the migrants, you have a general slide in the overall population. And so that's really what's being addressed here. Now, a variety of countries I would only mention in passing do have various programs that subsidize childbirth, Kindergeld in Germany. So you do get paid for children in an effort to combat some of this depopulation. But that's what you're looking at now. And then finally, population falls with or without migration. It doesn't matter if migration continues on current patterns. If you project out between 2017 and 2050, what you see in Portugal, Italy, Greece, etc., is falling population in terms of the number of people they're actually making legal. I'll offer you just a few more hypotheses, if you will, as to what's fueling this grievance. And one that I thought was interesting that the French ambassador to the U.S. actually mentioned a few months ago, I thought bared some looking into it. He essentially said that part of this concern is a result of an increasing disassociation of people from each other. And by that, he was talking about a decline in trade unions, a decline in France of the institution that was the Catholic Church, and how these institutions essentially were the glue of society. In many ways, they bolstered the middle class, they held people together, they held people in civic association. So in 2000, the American political scientist, Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam wrote a book called Bowling Alone, where he looked at this phenomenon in the U.S. And he looked at bowling leagues as a metaphor for this phenomenon. Sorry, it's hard to see, but all you really need to know is just after World War II, men and women's bowling leagues skyrocketed. Everyone was in a league. Everyone was bowling down at the local bowling alley. By 2000, when he wrote the book, it had dropped off dramatically. And he projected by 2010, I don't have the latest numbers, that it was going to continue to decline. Now, his point was in 2000, bowling hasn't declined in popularity. It's just people bowl alone now, not in the league. And that was a metaphor for a decline in what he called social capital in the United States, the loss of civic association. What we can see in Europe, over here on the right, is a similar decline across a variety of measures. Attended at a public meeting or a town hall, school affairs, up here at the top, down from 1972, almost at 25%, all the way down till about almost 10% in 1995, just looking toward to 95. Served as an officer or some club or organization, also in decline. Served on a committee or some local organization, also in decline in Europe. Member of some group interested in better government, also in marginal decline in Europe. So some people looked at this as a kind of anime. People aren't in these groups, and therefore there's a disaffection, and that breeds a kind of overall discontent with governance. I will leave that to you if you think that's part of it, but here are some trends associated with that. Let's look at church, praying alone. This is 1995 to 2000, 2005 to 2008, 2005, 2008 in the darker red, 1995, 2000 in the lighter pink. Poland, decline of not much, about 2%. Netherlands, much more dramatic decline. France has pretty much been holding its own through that 10 or 15 or so year period. Italy has dropped off as well. Look at England here, the various denominations, Anglican, Roman Catholic being the two biggest. This is the drop in church attendance in those denominations from 1980 to 2005. Again, a lot of this in terms of the explanation depends on what side of the aisle, left or right, you sit on as to what is actually causing it, but I'm offering you a variety of them. Bargaining alone, decline in trade unions. Now this, critics argue, has had a dual effect. It's not only a decline in civic association, it's also one of the reasons we're seeing rising inequality. I would also add automation, globalization. There's a lot of other more structural and international reasons for this, but certainly trade unions, a lot of people have cited the decline of them as a reason for it. This is just from 1970 to 2003, but you can see the Economist magazine here charts that decline in the United States, France, Germany, and Britain. If you look to the European Union, 2012 to 2014, lighter colors, this is probably the hardest to see, I apologize, but I can tell you that across all of these measures, 2012 to 2014, with the exception of Lithuania, Latvia, and Croatia over here on the left, for which I don't know how good the numbers were in the early 90s, you can see that there's been a decline. The dark blue has dropped off to the light blue in Poland, the Czech Republic, dark blue dropping off to the light blue, and overall in the EU 14, those members of the European Union that were there prior to 2014, you can see an overall drop-off of, looks like about 5 to 10% in those years in terms of trade union membership. And the last reason, it could be the most obvious reason, is that a lot of these countries' populations think that their leadership, their business leadership in particular, is totally corrupt. So the darker colors indicate those areas where, if you surveyed the population, 77% or so would say, yeah, our business culture is totally corrupt. The lighter colors have more faith, if you will, in that business culture. So that could be a more practical reason. We just trust the elites because we know there's corruption. And they're in charge, so it must be their fault. Optimism for the future of the European Union. Back here in 2007, you had the total pessimistic number at about 24%, and the total optimistic number, if you surveyed the European Union states at the time, close to 70%. That number dropped off, especially during the economic crisis. Less faith, less confidence in the European Union, rising lack of confidence, leveled out, and then experienced a bit of a resurgence, again, leveling out, dropping. But about the time of Brexit, we've seen a little bit of resurgence just because a lot of people offer all the problems that Britain's had actually executing Brexit. All right, I'll wrap up here with a few of the implications. But essentially, how do we think about foreign policy in these movements? I talked about what they are. And here are some general trends that I was able to divine from the literature. A lot of the people who look at these sorts of things look at the degree to which foreign policy really is seen as an extension of domestic policy. Right? So we see here Viktor Orban and Matteo Salvini. Matteo Salvini from Italy, again, the Northern League leader in Italy, the leader of the Fidesz party in Hungary, essentially trying to form a cross-national coalition, if you will, of states and populist, right-wing populist causes, especially on the eve of the May European Union Member of Parliament elections. Right? So it's not about Hungary versus Italy, it's about us across national lines versus the elite or the other party. Transactional approaches that can change very quickly. Consistency in government is sometimes hard to divine when you're dealing with these kinds of movements. Traffic in conspiracy theories. Here's one for you. You see it repeatedly. But in Poland, the former defense minister, there he is. He claimed, well, I'll tell you what this is first. This is the French helicopter aircraft carrier, the Mistral. They built 2 of them for Russia and was about to deliver those to Russia on the eve of 2014 when Russia invaded Crimea. NATO prevailed upon France. France agreed that those should not go to Russia after that. They eventually found a buyer in Egypt with the help of Saudi Arabia, and so they went to Egypt, not to Russia. But he subscribed to the view that was pushed in the Russian press, Sputnik and RT, that actually it just went to Egypt for $1, and what Egypt did was just turn around and give it to Russia. Now, it never really happened, but that didn't stop the Polish defense minister from running around and saying essentially Egypt had given away the Mistral and the French were to blame and it was all a cover-up and it's now with the Russians. Guided by a strong desire to take the opposite approach. Look, if we're saying the elites aren't doing things right, when I come into power, no matter what that elite policy was, I'm changing it. It's the opposite approach. Internal and external enemies trying to thwart the people's will. This is a constant narrative. Even in power, you have to keep this narrative going because now it can't be your fault if things aren't going well. It has to be somebody else's fault if there's problems, right? So you keep that narrative going. And they are self-consciously, to a point of purposefully being undiplomatic to distinguish themselves in many respects from the previous administrations in these various countries. Now again, these are generalizations. They don't apply in all cases. But if you divine across all of these cases that I just talked about, these are some of the things that you'll see. So how do they end? Generally speaking, you have two choices on the extreme. They essentially take over in some sort of radical revolution, which is not as likely, nor is likely that you have some sort of radical suppression, essentially, particularly in today's age. So you do usually have some combination of underlying grievances that are assuaged, co-optation into government. When they get into government, can no longer blame the elite because now they're a part of the elite. And they get into a power-sharing arrangement, and then we can, in some cases, see an evening out of a sort of a more centrist approach, at least an approach that doesn't involve us versus the elite telling that narrative. But I will essentially leave it at that, and I apologize. I went about 5 minutes too long, so Mary, please correct me.
Wait for it to turn green. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for being here. It's a real pleasure for me to come speak to you a little bit today. Let me set my timer because I want to make sure I keep track. Okay. So thank you, Colonel Driver, for those facts related to what is causing European populism. Colonel Driver did an excellent job of presenting some of the social, political, economic, and even geographic causes behind the rise in populism in Europe. So today, given that the Great Decisions magazine that we looked at mentioned some of the perceptions that Europeans are struggling with, and specifically the perceptions around immigration, I'd like to sort of home in on that specific issue and what its effects are on populism in the European Union. So I also took an unscientific poll of my own to see if my friends' views accorded with what was in the Great Decisions magazine and what pundits have said about what's driving European populism. And in fact, 44% of my respondents did agree that it was immigration, especially in this century, and 33% said it was economic. Some said it was a combination. Many said it was a combination. Europeans are very sophisticated, and they know all the nuances, and so and then the remainder said it was neither of those issues really, and that it was a combination of other factors. And I will share some of their observations a little bit later on. Let's see. You can't believe the chicken scratching on these note cards I have. So. But anyway, so I want to, as I said, I want to talk about a more psychological facet of immigration. And I'm sure many of you have heard the saying that perception is reality. And so I want to talk about the perceptions that are creating realities for Europeans around immigration. So I also want to say that from my own perceptions, having lived in Europe for 27 years, Colonel Driver showed a slide and mentioned the Swedish subway, where the Swedes were essentially apologizing for the state of their city, for Stockholm. And I have to say, I have encountered many, many beggars in many subway stations across Europe in major cities. There are beggars who come up and try to wash your windshield. There are people who try to bag your groceries. There are people who try to sell you bits of string as bracelets. There are people who have babies to use them as, to make them more pathetic looking so that you will give them money. Essentially, wherever you go in a major European city today, you do see a lot of people that are that appear to be from places outside of Europe. You see a lot of sub-Saharan Africans, you see people wearing headscarves that appear to be from North Africa and the Middle East, and you also see people that appear to be from the subcontinent. And they'll be selling flowers in restaurants, and proprietors will not be able to send them off and things like that. And so perception-wise, it does look different than I can say it looked when I was a child in Europe. We used to have, I grew up in Germany, but I've lived in other countries as well. And we used to have Roma gypsies that would, encampments of Roma gypsies would spring up outside of villages during the summer months, and then there'd be often word that there's a spike in crime and so forth, and people would attribute that to these gypsy populations that were there. And you would see every day in Germany Turkish workers who were there, and of course Muslims who were living in Germany and working alongside Germans, and there were many millions of them starting from the 1960s, and it was generally not an issue. As far as I could tell as a child, it was not an issue. So things have changed, and I want to talk about the reasons behind the perceptions of change in a little bit. One of the articles, another article in the magazine talked about migration being a constant factor in Europe, and that is true. Migration has always been going on in Europe. But again, it's these changes that have happened recently in the late 20th century and in the early 21st century that have kind of changed perceptions around immigration in Europe, and are feeding a perception that it's both dangerous and that it's not being well controlled, and that the government doesn't have a handle on how to control borders. Now, you may or may not know that each country in the European Union controls its own immigration policies within its borders, and this is an issue because they consider it directly tied with their sovereignty whether or not they are allowed to control who comes in their borders. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, we know that the European Union right now is really struggling to manage perceptions of how it deals with immigration at large into the territory of the European Union, because just yesterday they issued a report that's trying to dispel 14 different myths that they see as being out there among the public about migration specifically. And so I'm going to talk about 4 of those myths today, but it was interesting to see how difficult it is for the European Union to dispel those myths when, in fact, immigration has dropped precipitously since the crisis year of 2015. It's down to below 10% what it was the year before the crisis. So, now I don't think it's going to be easy for the European Union to fight these perceptions because there are some structural issues that it has to contend with, and I can't get this off here. It seems like it's not in the right place. And the EU finds itself in a little bit of a catch-22 as this issue, as they try to deal with this issue, because the EU is not a supranational organization. It does not have the right to control, as I said, what's going on inside of different countries as far as how they manage immigration. So the EU's problem is it needs to federate more and become more like a United States of Europe, as it was originally intended to be long ago. And yet, the more it does that, the more it tries to push that narrative that it needs more control and it needs more integration in order to solve these big issues, the more you get populism springing up and people pushing back and saying, we don't want to lose sovereignty of our country. We don't want the EU to determine what our identity is nationally, and we don't want the EU to be able to have the right to tell us how many immigrants we have to allow in because they feel it's changing their social fabric in many cases. So the more the EU, tries to get control of the issue and blames the fact that it's not further integrated, the more it's kind of causing things like Brexit, because Brexit was directly, the number one issue behind Brexit was in fact immigration. There were a lot of different workers coming from other parts of the EU to work more cheaply in Britain, and so British people decided they didn't want to be able, they didn't want to have more immigration. It was, again, a perception that immigration was changing their way of life. And so that raised it to a crisis level, and UKIP certainly profited from that crisis perception. And crisis is, in fact, normally an integrator. Jean Monnet, who was one of the founding fathers of the EU, famously said that crises are great federators, but in fact, immigration has had a profoundly centrifugal effect, and again, witness Brexit. It has tended to tear apart the unity of the EU recently. Now, you would think that somebody like Emmanuel Macron, who's the current president of France, would try to enhance the EU's success narrative about this, but he said as little as a year ago in spring, mind you, this is 3 years post-immigration crisis. He said, and I quote, "Europe is facing an unprecedented wave of migration and will continue to do so." So even Macron is using immigration as a way for him to try to, convince Europeans that more needs to be done. And one of the things he wants to do, from my perspective, is he wants to control the narrative. If you've seen some of his new initiatives, he wants to control what Europeans can see and hear about the EU and so forth. And he's saying to protect from these outside forces that are trying to create perceptions that aren't real. But in fact, it also gives the impression that the EU is going to somehow censor some things that are being that are in their public square. So. So it's hard for the EU to get its story straight when you hear both of those kinds of things happening. You hear Macron saying that the crisis remains and it could go off at any minute, and you hear the EU, as late as yesterday, trying to say, no, we've got a handle on this. In fact, the EU doesn't have a handle on it, and I'm going to talk about, as I said, those 4 different myths and why they structurally cannot really deal with it in a way that they would like to. Before I do that, I want to read to you a quote from a 2015 essay that was written by a Norwegian professor who was writing in a book about European problems today. His name was Jonathan Moses, and he's with the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim. He wrote, quote, "My intent is to temper a common perception of Europe, a picture of Europe full to the gills with foreigners, mostly draped in burqas and turbans, and going quickly to hell in a handbasket. Foreigners are seen as a growing threat to romanticized images of the European polity, bringing with them values and social practices that threaten the essence of European traditions. This picture is familiar to anybody following European politics in recent years." And again, I agree with that picture is familiar, and as I say, from just observation, it appears that there are more people in Europe that come from lands that he mentioned, and so that is creating perception. He says that the picture of immigration, the picture of immigration has changed from one of intra-European migration to a more globalized variety of newcomers who are coming from lands that have vastly inferior living standards and predominantly non-Western ideologies and social practices. And I'm talking in the main, as he was, about this picture of Islam as this picture of immigration as being Islamic. And it's perceived far differently, again, than the one that Turkish workers, for example, in Germany practiced, or that Albanians or Kosovars or Bosniaks practice. Instead, it's a picture of one that is related with terrorism, and this is what far-right populists assert, that it's a dangerous form of Islam and that it's related to terrorism. It's a 9/11 sort of Islam, and it's the Charlie Hebdo, it's the Bataclan, it's Madrid, Nice, Berlin, and in fact there have been some incidents that have been perpetrated by Muslim people, whether they were from Europe or from abroad, and so that just fuels that perception. Now, the EU will have a very hard time dispelling some of these perceptions because, first of all, the people that are already in Europe are not going away, and they're going to continue to live there, and unless they're assimilated, they will continue to be a population that people can say, is not, that it is more of a burden on society than a help. The crisis, in other words, is not over, according to many, but that is exactly one of the myths that the EU is trying to overcome right now. They're trying to say the crisis is over. They say the myth is that the crisis ensues, but it continues, but they're saying it's over. And again, I offer you Macron's quote about that. It isn't quite over. Secondly, another myth is that Europe is trying to combat the myth that migrants are a burden on economies, but their own budget has increased 200% for the 2021 budget to deal specifically with migration and migrant issues. And for my math, which is probably, somebody else in the audience probably even has better math on this, but at least $40 billion or euro of the roughly 165 billion euro budget is being spent right now on migrant issues. And those budgets come from the countries that belong to the EU. So it's not really, it's a difficult myth to dispel because it is coming from, they have to make choices about where they're going to spend their money, and that money is being spent on things they would rather use for perhaps welfare programs, pensions, and so forth. We already have enough trouble getting countries that are in the EU and also in NATO to pay their share of NATO contributions, so that's just another facet of security that they have to worry about in their minds. The third myth is that reinstating internal borders is a good solution for nations. Now, populists have done this. They have in some cases reinstated internal borders. It's happened in Denmark. It's happened in Austria, Hungary. And the fact is that walls do work, but what do they work for? If you're talking about whether they work to protect your sovereignty and your country from outsiders, well, then they work. But the EU is talking about something else. The EU is saying walls don't work and they're a step backwards because they inhibit integration and the supranational sort of push that the EU would like to see. And the conspiracy about that is that the EU wants to see a lot of migration because it will water down the individual identities of the different nations in Europe, and only then can the EU become a supranational state when there isn't really any loyalty to any particular country or way of life. Once everybody's sort of European, it's just not going to matter anymore whether you have a border or not, right? So that's the conspiracy about why they think, many people, populist supporters think that the European Union wants to do away with internal borders, not simply an economic reason. And then finally, the fourth myth is that the EU has some, well, that is the secret plot that the EU wants to encourage migration. In fact, the EU, the reality is, as Colonel Driver's slide showed, the EU doesn't need a secret plot to encourage immigration. The facts are there, that there are 40 countries roughly that need immigration in order to continue to thrive and grow. The birth rates are falling, and so in order for countries, like fully a third of the countries, about 15 countries, especially in the East, their populations will fall with or without immigration. So something has to be done. And that message isn't really getting through to people. And so the great decision that each European nation now faces is how best to confront the inevitable demographic decline over the next 30 years, and whether cooperation with their neighbors on this issue through an organization such as the EU or some other way is preferable to having 27, once the UK is gone, 27 different solutions for this problem. A few respondents to my survey did mention, beyond saying there were many different causes for immigration, I just want to leave you with one. I've gone over so much already, but one I want to leave you with is, someone wrote, the main reason why populism found fertile ground among EU nations was the notion that EU citizens in their own country have less rights, less attention, and less care and protection than immigrants enjoy. This notion was building on the growing dissatisfaction of the ultra-liberal politics that have created a dangerous perception that the rights of minorities are somehow more important than normality. And this person specifically talked about social mores and family traditions and things, and said that the EU values global affairs and national politics over the people and their security and their way of life. Also talked about high-profile crimes committed by immigrants and the EU's inability to control its own borders. So again, the great decision is what is the EU going to do, and how do we change the narrative so that it makes sense to the EU and to Europeans to work together somehow to overcome this issue and to realize that immigration is in fact part of their solution. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry for that long.
Yes, I think it's working. Good afternoon. As they said at the beginning, my name is Felipe Cuero. I am from Spain. And I am not here to present the Spanish perception of this problem. I will talk more about the European view of these problems, but during the question and answer, you can ask if you would like something about Spain, that I know that in this very demanding audience, there is some good experts in Spain, as my good friend Linda Figueroa. Okay, so being a privilege to be here, I would like to say up front a couple of comments. I would like to say that not all the populism are the same. So sometimes we talk about populism, but not all are the same. And talking about the influence in the European politics, they are not all the same. So we can think that they can combine their efforts to make a kind of joint effort to change things in the European Union, but they are not the same. So normally they have their own agenda, the political agenda, and sometimes they are not fighting in the same direction. And the second point that I would like to make is that not all of the Europeans are the same. So I am from Spain, so my vision is, or my perception is completely probably different than a perception from Germany or Italy. We are southern, but we have a different view, and all this is about psychological perception, as Mrs. Foster told before. So this is what I am trying to explain. And I will try to be more focused on the impact of this phenomenon on the European integration process that we are, as I think, at a critical moment today. We are at a critical moment because in the last 80 years, Europe has benefited of a strong prosperity and security because two factors. One of them is the US partnership, of course, and the second one is the European integration itself. And this is what I will focus on this, the effects of the populism in the European integration, if I may. I will try to be as brief as possible, but speaking in English, I am very slowly. Speaking in Spanish, I will finish very, very fast. So the main point is that, as Colonel Driver explained very good, that today populism is less, in my view, about the result of an identity problem, on identity crisis. It's more about the effects or the impacts of the heavy or extreme globalization process. I think this is the main topic today. It's different of the from the populism movements in a different time of the history. I will elaborate a little bit about what are, in my view, the causes for this populism in Europe. As we said before, populism is a strategy. And being a strategy, what is the intention of this strategy? The intention, in my view, is gaining the people's support, and the way to win the support of the people is to blame somebody. In Europe, it's easy because all the countries, we have the European Union to blame. So you can find in Spain people blaming on European Union from our authorities or another countries because it's easy to do. But at the end of the day, the European Union authorities represent us and work for us. So it's something that we talked about the European Union as something external to us. That is an interesting phenomenon. But the populism movement is trying to blame somebody. So with this enemy in front, they will try to gain the support of the population. So at the end, what we are talking about is the real problem in Europe is the perception of a lack, in my view, of democratic delivery or results in the people. The people, they don't see the results of the current governments. They don't see, or they see a lack of accountability, because in the European Union, it's not a country. It's an international organization made by countries. And the thing is that if I see the European Union Commission president, that is the executive power government in the European Union, I don't see him, or a lot of people don't see him as the president of the government, of the prime minister. So there is a kind of, in the people, there is a lack of accountability of the European Union authorities. And this is also a problem that we need to work and to solve. At the end, what we have, what we can see in the people is a lack of, or it's a sense of powerlessness. Powerlessness, I mean, the ordinary people, they don't see how the authorities can face the major challenges that we have in Europe. So they don't see how the authorities are trying to stop the immigration. They don't see how the authorities are trying to control their national borders. They don't see how the authorities are able to face the terrorist threats, or they don't see how the authorities can try to reduce the unemployment that you have seen in the slides. The level of unemployment in some countries, in my country, is a big problem. So there is a sense that the citizens has the feeling that the authorities are not working to solve the real problems. And this is what the populists are using, trying to gain support for them. The authorities trying to break the link between the politicians in the lead and the people in this dialectic that is we and they. That is the one they use. We are the good and they are the bad. So this lack of perception or this lack of connection between the authorities and the people is what they are using with the employing of some we can call enablers, like, for example, the media, like the social media, like also is related with the speed of changes. Everything is very fast. Everything in Europe is happening the same in the United States. It's happening very fast. So the people it seems that there is no control of the situation because everything is going too fast and we don't see who is taking the lead of that. At the end of the day, European Union is tackling or dealing with the problems, but the way that the European Union works is slowly. They have to find a consensus, and the decision-making process is one of the problems, because at the end, they will have a wonderful solution, but the solution is making very slowly. And the people today demands quick decisions. And this is something that the European Union needs to work, just to tell the people that we are able to take quick decisions. The examples with the immigration crisis, it took several years for the European Union to agree on what to do against this problem, or what to do to solve this problem. So this is a big issue. Also, I will not be very extensive on the external influences in the European Union integration, because there are regional powers that maybe they are interested in weaken this European integration. Trying to be a weak Europe is better for somebody in our neighborhood. And having said that, what are the impacts for the European Union? The impact at this critical moment, as I said, is a critical moment, but it's a critical moment because in May we will have parliament elections in the European Union. I think it's 29 May. And last month, the European Council on Foreign Relations published an article saying that in these parliament elections in May, the populism movements in Europe, the ones that we have seen in the slides, previous slides, will gain probably around 30% of the parliament seats. 30% is an important number. I will not elaborate a lot how to take the decisions, how we are making the decisions in the European Union, but I will just say that the European Union, the European Parliament control the budget. European Parliament control the appointment of the European Union Commission, that is the executive power, and implement and decide the European Union policies. So if 30% of the seats are under movements that would like to destroy the European Union from inside, that is not always the case, as I said at the beginning, then we can see changes in the European Union policies, for example, external policy relations with the US, relations with Russia, with China, Turkey. So we could see changes on that. We could see changes on the budget. That means that the budget are not devoted so strong as we wish in European security aspects, but it's going to another aspect. We can see changes in the immigration policy. We can see changes in the trade, external trade. So we can see at the end changes in the democracy itself in the European Union. So the impact of the level of representative of the populist parties in the next May parliamentary elections will be tremendous for the European Union. So I can say that we are in the critical moment. We will be at the critical moment. But having said that, at the beginning I said that not all the populist moments are the same. So the good news is that not all of them are together a kind of populist coalition against the European Union. I don't see that in the future. What we can do, or what the European Union can do, I know that I have to finish. What we can do, the European Union, I think that they need to enhance the democracy, to better connect the citizens with the authorities. That is something that is not working. It's not working because between the citizens and the European Union authorities, there are layers of authorities. In Spain, we have our province, we have the regions, we call autonomous communities, that some of them are really strong. Then we have the nations. So working in a better accountability for the politicians of the European Union will be something that the citizens will agree that is something that they need to identify who is working for them and what are they doing. It's something that today is not happening very good in the European Union. Also, it's not just to deliver better, but it's also to communicate better. Communicate better because we are not communicating very good in the European Union. We are not talking to people, we are not explaining what we are doing to solve the immigration, what we are doing to solve the terrorism, what we are doing to solve all the unemployment, all the economic and social problems that we have. And especially with these topics, I think that they should to work more in making a better balance in the social inequality, a better balance of equality, of course, not inequality, but solving the problem that the current driver put in his slide, that there is a lot of inequality in the country. So the people need to know that they are working for reducing the social inequality on their behalf. If not, they will not accept these policies. So at the end, those are my thoughts. And I think that the European Union is an asymmetric entity that is trying to integrate more and more. The economic integration is running for a long time, but the security and the internal security and external security are things that we need to develop better because it's what the citizens are expecting to see results. 3 days ago, President Macron started probably the official campaign for the European Union parliamentary elections in May, delivering in his webpage, official webpage, a document trying to expand and to enhance the decision-making process and creating a new body dealing with internal security in the European Union. I think I see this as one step further, trying to tell the citizens what we are trying to do to solve the problems. Because at the end, this is, as Mrs. Foster explains perfectly before, is a psychological aspect, and everything is about perceptions. Sorry for being much longer than expected, but I am ready for the question and answer. Thank you very much.